The tin was small, dented at one corner, and painted with faded red flowers that had long since lost their color to years of hard sun and harder living. Susanna Barrett held it in both hands like it was the most sacred thing she had ever touched, because in that moment it was. Her knuckles had gone white around its edges. The wildflowers inside dried bluebonnets, a few sprigs of Indian paintbrush, some yellowed prairie clover rustled faintly against the metal as her hands shook. Perry Hayes stood 3 feet away from her on the porch of her father's ranch house, his hat in his hands, his jaw set in that terrible way that meant he had already made up his mind, and there was nothing left in the world she could say to change it. Behind them, the screen door creaked open, and a small figure appeared. Ellie Hayes, 7 years old and barefoot, still wearing her nightgown even though the morning sun had already climbed a full hand above the horizon. She looked between her father and Susanna with the solemn gravity only a child who had already lost one parent could carry. She had gathered those flowers herself over 3 mornings, sneaking out before breakfast to comb the fields behind the barn. Susanna knew because she had watched from the kitchen window, heart so full it hurt. "Papa," Ellie said quietly, "are you leaving now?" Perry Hayes did not look at his daughter. He looked at Susanna. And in his eyes there was something that was not indifference and not coldness, but something far more devastating than either. It was the look of a man who was making the worst choice of his life and knew it fully and was choosing it anyway. "I have to go," he said. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Susanna felt the ripple of them move through her chest, through her stomach, down to the soles of her feet. 3 months. 3 months of something she had not dared to name because naming it would make losing it unbearable. And now here she was, holding a tin of wildflowers gathered by a 7-year-old girl, and the man she had fallen in love with across every ordinary miracle of those 3 months was walking away because of a secret he had kept buried so long it had roots deeper than she could reach. Ellie crossed the porch and pressed herself against Susanna's side. She reached up and touched the tin with one small finger. "Those are for when you come back," she whispered. She was looking at her father when she said it, but her voice was pitched just loud enough that Susanna understood the words were meant for her too. A promise. A child's ferocious, unwavering faith in the possibility of return. Perry Hayes finally looked away. He put his hat on his head and he walked down the porch steps, and the sound of his boots on the dry dirt road was the loneliest sound Susanna Barrett had ever heard. She stood there until she could no longer see the dust his horse kicked up against the pale morning sky. Then she sat down on the porch step beside Ellie and held the tin in her lap and said nothing at all for a very long time. She had arrived in Harlan Creek, Texas, in the first week of March 1882 on the southbound stage from San Antonio. She had not come looking for love. She had come running from the specific, grinding desperation of a woman who had tried every respectable option available to her and found each one sealed shut. Her father, Daniel Barrett, had died the previous autumn of a heart that gave out over 2 seasons of drought and debt, leaving Susanna at 26 with a rented house in San Antonio, $43, and a talent for keeping ledgers that no employer in the city seemed willing to recognize as valuable when housed in a woman's body. She had answered a notice in the San Antonio Express, placed by a man named Aldous Crane, who ran the general store in Harlan Creek and needed a bookkeeper who could also manage correspondence. The notice had specified, in language so careful it was almost funny, that the position was open to persons of any description provided they were honest, sober, and could do arithmetic faster than Aldous himself, which, the notice admitted with what Susanna suspected was rare self-awareness, was not saying very much. She had written back immediately. Aldous Crane had replied within the week. And so on the first Tuesday of March 1882, Susanna Barrett stepped off the southbound stage into a town that smelled of horses and cedar smoke, and the particular dry sweetness of Texas spring air before it turns brutal with heat. And she had thought, well, this will do for now. Harlan Creek had a main street with 8 buildings on each side, a church at the north end and a livery at the south, a jail with a broken window that had been covered with a flour sack since at least the previous summer judging by its color, and a population of approximately 340 people, not counting the ranches scattered across the surrounding valley. It was not a prosperous town, but it was not a dying one either. It occupied that particular middle space of frontier life that required constant maintenance and refused to resolve itself one way or the other. Aldous Crane was a round-faced man of 60 with white mutton-chop sideburns and an expression of permanent mild bewilderment that Susanna would come to understand was not stupidity, but rather a genuine and endearing surprise that the world kept happening to him. He met her at the stage stop, took her one trunk without being asked, and told her in the first 2 minutes that he had been in the Creek town for 11 years, that his wife had passed 4 years ago, that he missed her every day, and that he hoped Susanna liked the room above the store because he had done his best to make it comfortable, but he was aware that his best in domestic matters was not what most people would call impressive. The room was small but clean. The window faced west toward the hill country, and in the evenings the light came through it in long gold bars that made everything look briefly precious. Susanna unpacked her trunk, arranged her 3 books on the windowsill, and told herself she was fine. She met Perry Hayes on her 3rd day in Harlan Creek. He came into the store in the late afternoon, tracking red dust across the floor Susanna had just swept, and she was prepared to be annoyed about it, except that he stopped immediately when he saw the clean floor and looked at his boots, and then looked up at her with an expression of genuine chagrin that disarmed her entirely. "I am sorry about that," he said. He meant it. She could tell. "It is all right," she said, which was also true. He was buying flour and salt and a spool of thread in a dark blue that was clearly not going to match anything domestic, but which, she would learn later, was for Ellie's kite string. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way of men who had spent their lives doing physical work rather than the gym-manufactured breadth that belonged to men of leisure. His hair was dark and wanted cutting. His eyes were a particular shade of gray-green that made her think of sage after rain, and she noticed them with the same slightly startled quality of noticing something beautiful in an unexpected place, and not being sure what to do about it. He set his items on the counter and she added the figures and told him the total, and he paid without counting the coins back, which meant either he trusted her or he trusted himself, and she found she liked him more for not making a show of checking her arithmetic. "You are the new bookkeeper," he said. It was not a question. "Susanna Barrett," she said. "Perry Hayes," he said. "I have a spread about 4 miles east. The double H, how many acres?" He looked slightly surprised by the directness of the question, then pleased by it. 612, he said, "though 40 of those are rock and canyon and not much use except for being scenic. Our cattle prices what they were last year, down about 8% from the spring drives," he said. "Not ruinous but not comfortable either. Is there much debt on the land?" He studied her for a moment. "You are very forthcoming with questions for someone who has been in this county 3 days. I am interested in the economic condition of the area," she said. "I find it easier to do my job well if I understand the context." "Fair enough," he said, and then he smiled. It was not the performed smile of a man trying to charm a woman, but the real, unrehearsed smile of someone who had just been surprised into it, and it transformed his face in a way that made Susanna look slightly away and then back because she had not been prepared for it. He paid for his goods and said good afternoon and left, and Susanna went back to the ledger she had been correcting and told herself very firmly that she was not thinking about the color of his eyes. She saw him again the following Tuesday when he came back for coffee and a new axe handle. The Tuesday after that he bought lamp oil and stayed 20 minutes talking with Aldous about the spring market. By the 4th Tuesday she had stopped pretending the coincidence was purely commercial, and so, she suspected, had he. The conversation started as practical things: land values, cattle breeds, The reliability of the San Antonio to El Paso rail line as a factor in beef prices. She had a good mind for economics, and he had a good mind for land and animals. And the intersection of those two things turned out to produce conversations that lasted longer than either of them intended, and left her feeling sharper and more alive than she had in a long time. Then there was a Wednesday in late March when she had gone to the post office just before noon, and the street outside was empty except for Perry Hayes, who was standing next to his hitched horse in the particular stillness of a man who has received bad news and has not yet decided how to carry it. He was holding a letter, not reading it, just holding it, and his whole body had a quality of weight that she recognized because she had felt it herself in the weeks after her father died. She almost kept walking. She had enough sense to understand that whatever was happening to him in that moment was private and not hers to intrude upon. But the impulse to walk past him was overridden by something that was partly compassion and partly the simple, ungovernable fact that she did not want to leave him standing there alone with it. "Are you all right?" she asked. He looked up. He was not a man who concealed things well when he was caught entirely off guard. "Not particularly," he said, with an honesty that surprised both of them. "Do you need anything?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. And then, contradicting himself almost immediately, "Actually, would you walk with me a little? Just down to the end of the street and back. I find I need to move." She walked with him. They did not talk about whatever was in the letter. They talked about the weather turning and whether the spring rains would come early this year, and he pointed out a red-tailed hawk riding the thermals above the hill to the east, and by the time they had walked to the end of the street and back, his shoulders had loosened, and some of the terrible weight had shifted if not lifted. "Thank you," he said, when they were back in front of the post office. "I did not do anything," she said. "You did," he said simply, and went to his horse. That was the evening she admitted to herself, alone in her small room above the store with the western light going red and long across the floorboards, that she was in real trouble. Not the comfortable, manageable kind of attraction she had felt once or twice before and set aside without much difficulty. The other kind. The kind that had no good sense in it and did not care. She asked Aldous about him the next morning as casually as she could manage, which was not very casual at all because Aldous had 40 years of watching people and excellent instincts for what was underneath the question. "Good man," Aldous said, weighing out coffee. "Hard worker. Honest. Fair to his hands." "Those are not small things. What about his family?" Aldous set down the coffee scoop. "His wife Clara died 2 years ago," he said, and his voice had the careful gentleness of someone handing over something fragile. "Fever. She was ill 2 weeks and gone. He has a daughter, Ellie, who is 7. He is raising her alone." Susanna absorbed this. "That is hard," she said. "It is," Aldous agreed. "Clara was a fine woman. Perry has not been the same since, though I will say in the last few weeks he seems somewhat more himself." He glanced at her with the most artless sideways look she had ever seen on a man who was being entirely deliberate. "Cannot think what might have changed." "Do not," she said. "I am not saying anything," he said, and resumed weighing the coffee with elaborate innocence. The change, when it came quietly. Perry began arriving at the store with slightly more frequency than his supply needs strictly required. He found reasons, a cracked harness fitting, a question about whether Aldous stocked a particular kind of pickle jar, a request for Susanna's opinion on which of 2 almanacs had better weather prediction for the Texas Hill Country. The excuses were transparent, and she suspected he knew they were transparent, and she suspected he had decided this was an acceptable state of affairs. In the second week of April he asked if she would like to ride out to see the bluebonnets on the hill south of town, because they were at their peak and would be gone in 2 weeks, and they were worth seeing. She said yes before she had finished processing the invitation, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of her own feelings. He brought an extra horse, a steady bay mare named Constance whom Susanna liked immediately, and they rode out in the middle of a Saturday afternoon when the sky was a blue so intense it almost hurt to look at. The bluebonnets covered the hillside in a wash of color that was genuinely extraordinary, the kind of thing that happened only in a narrow window each year when the conditions were exactly right. And she sat on Constance at the edge of the field and felt something ease in her chest that had been tight since her father died. "My wife loved them," Perry said, beside her on a dun gelding he called Marshall. His voice was even, not raw. "She used to bring Ellie out here every year when Ellie was tiny. She said they were proof that beauty was not wasted just because it did not last." Susanna thought about that. "She sounds like she was wise." "She was," he said. "She was also stubborn as a post and could outshoot me at 50 yards and made the best corn bread I have ever eaten, which I have never been able to replicate despite 3 years of trying." He said it with the kind of fond specificity that meant the grief had moved, if not resolved, into something livable. "I think she would have liked you." Susanna felt the sentence settle over her like something warm. "I think I would have liked her," she said honestly. They were quiet for a while, watching the wind move through the bluebonnets in slow blue waves. Then Perry said, "Ellie has been asking about you." "Has she?" "She wants to know if you would come to dinner on Sunday." "I told her I would ask, but that you might be busy." "I am not busy on Sunday," Susanna said. He looked at her with that same expression he had worn in the store on the first day, surprised and pleased and not quite managing to hide either. "Good," he said. She met Ellie that Sunday over a dinner that Perry had clearly worked very hard on, evidenced by the fact that there were 3 separate dishes and a pie, which Susanna strongly suspected involved a significant portion of Saturday afternoon. Ellie was small for 7, with her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's dark curling hair, and she regarded Susanna with a solemnity and a directness that made Susanna feel she was being evaluated by someone whose judgment was worth having. "Do you know how to play checkers?" Ellie asked before Susanna had fully sat down. "I do," Susanna said. "Papa cheats," Ellie said. "I do not cheat," Perry said from the kitchen. "I use strategy." "He moves pieces when he thinks I am not looking," Ellie told Susanna, in the tone of someone documenting a case. "I will watch him very carefully," Susanna said. Ellie appeared satisfied with this answer. She climbed into her chair and unfolded her napkin with the ceremony of someone who had been specifically instructed to use the napkin tonight. And Susanna felt a warmth moving through her that had nothing to do with the spring evening and everything to do with the particular, specific rightness of being exactly where she was. After dinner, they played checkers on the porch while the sun went down behind the hills. Perry did not cheat, as far as Susanna could determine, but Ellie won anyway twice, with the ruthless efficiency of a child who had been practicing. Ellie accepted her victories with dignity and then fell asleep in her chair before the second game was fully concluded, her head dropping sideways against the porch rail, her breathing going slow and even. Perry carried her inside without waking her and came back out, and they sat in the porch chairs in the long blue dusk and talked about nothing particular and everything important for another hour. And when Susanna finally rose to go, Perry walked her to where she had hitched Constance and stood there in the dark with her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before she mounted. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking," she said. She rode back to Harlan Creek in the warm dark with her heart doing something complicated and wonderful, and she told herself she would be careful, she would be sensible, she would not run ahead of herself, and she believed approximately none of it. The following weeks had the quality of a dream that keeps threatening to end and keeps not ending. She went to dinner at the Double H 3 more Sundays. He came into the store more often. He began walking her back after the Sunday evening service at the church, which was 5 blocks and therefore entirely unnecessary, and which several people in Harlan Creek noticed and remarked upon in the way small towns remark upon things, with thorough and enthusiastic attention to detail. She learned him, the way you learn someone when you are paying close attention and they are paying close attention back. He read more than she had expected, history mostly, and a battered volume of Shakespeare's tragedies that he kept by his bed, and said he returned to regularly, because it reminded him that human beings had always been this complicated. He was patient with his cattle hands in a way that made them loyal, and direct about what he needed without being harsh, and she had watched him once resolve a dispute between two of his men over a card game debt with a fairness and economy that she found genuinely impressive. He was not an easy man in the sense of being simple or without difficulty, but he was a good one in the sense that mattered most. The things he said and the things he did pointed in the same direction. She learned the darker edges too, gradually. The way grief moved through him sometimes without warning, arriving in a tightening around his eyes when something small recalled Clara, a particular way the light fell, or a song that Ellie hummed without knowing its history. He never hid it, but he never made it a performance either. He simply felt it and went on, which she respected enormously. Ellie became her own particular joy. The child was fiercely intelligent and deeply curious, and had the kind of questions that required actual thought to answer. Why did stars stay in the same patterns? Were there books about the Comanche written by Comanche people? Was it true that there were places in the world where it was cold all year long? Susanna took these questions seriously, which Ellie recognized immediately and rewarded with a trust that felt like being given something precious and breakable. She had begun bringing Ellie books from the small collection she kept above the store, a volume of natural history with hand-colored illustrations, a geography with maps, a collection of poetry that Ellie professed to find boring, but which Susanna noticed her reading on her own when she thought no one was watching. In return, Ellie had begun taking Susanna to see things. The place by the creek where a great blue heron came every morning, the particular rock formation east of the barn that Ellie was convinced looked exactly like a sleeping bear, the field behind the house where, in the right season, wildflowers came up in such abundance that the ground looked painted. It was in that field, on a Thursday afternoon in late April, when Susanna had ridden out with a bookkeeping question for Perry and found, instead, that he had ridden into town, and Ellie was there alone at the kitchen table doing her lessons, that the first seeds were planted of what would become the tin. Ellie had looked up from her spelling book and said, without preamble, "Would you like to see where the flowers are?" They had walked out together, Susanna in her good boots which had not been intended for field walking and which got thoroughly dusty, and Ellie had crouched down among the bluebonnets and the paintbrush and the clover and the scattered wild prairie asters with the expertise of a small naturalist, naming each one for Susanna with the seriousness of someone conducting an official introduction. "These ones come back every year," Ellie had said, "even when the summer is very dry. Papa says they remember to come back even when things are hard." Susanna had looked at the flowers and thought about that longer than was probably warranted. Then she had sat down in the field entirely without regard for her skirt, and Ellie had sat beside her, and they had spent an hour doing nothing in particular except existing among the flowers and the spring warmth. And by the time Perry rode back and found them there, both of them pink-cheeked, and Ellie with clover in her hair, his expression had been one that Susanna had filed away carefully and taken back with her to town. It was in the last week of April that everything shifted, and then in the first week of May that everything broke. The shift came on a Saturday afternoon when she had gone to the post office again and found, as she had now found 4 times in 3 weeks, a letter addressed to her in a handwriting she recognized with the specific dread of someone whose past has not yet been fully outpaced. The letters were from a man in San Antonio named Theodore Marsh, who had been her father's business partner in the dry years before the drought ended any pretense of the partnership being viable, and who had thereafter appointed himself her father's creditor, and following Daniel Barrett's death, his daughter's problem. Theodore Marsh was not a villain in the way of dime novel outlaws. He was worse than that. He was a legal villain, the kind who operated entirely within the structure of the law as it existed, and used that structure with the precision of a surgeon's knife. He had held a promissory note signed by Daniel Barrett for $480, a sum contracted 6 years prior when the ranch was struggling, and the interest had run compound in the years since, and by Theodore Marsh's reckoning, which was careful and entirely accurate, Susanna owed him $612. She had no ranch to mortgage. She had no savings of substance. She had a salary of $15 a month from Aldous Crane, which, after room and board, left her approximately $6 a month to apply to a debt that was growing faster than she could address it. The letters from Theodore Marsh were always polite. They were worse for being polite. This one informed her that he had retained a solicitor in Bixar County, and that if the debt was not addressed within 90 days, legal action would be initiated. And did she perhaps have relations or acquaintances who might be in a position to assist? She did not tell Perry about the letters. She told herself this was because the problem was hers to solve and had nothing to do with him. She told herself she did not want to be the woman who arrived with obligations and deficits and required rescuing. She had spent the first 36 years of her father's life watching her mother be the woman who required rescuing, and she had sworn herself against it so completely that the oath had become reflexive and invisible, something she enacted without even consciously choosing it. She went home and worked on the figures again, and they came out the same as they had come out the previous 4 times she had worked on them, which was impossible. She needed another income or a lump sum or a miracle, and she was not in the habit of depending on miracles. Perry noticed that something had changed. Of course he did. He noticed things about her with an attention that she found both deeply gratifying and occasionally inconvenient, and the following Tuesday, when she was more distracted than usual over the store counter, he asked, quietly, whether everything was all right. "Fine," she said, in the tone that means the exact opposite. He waited. He was good at waiting. He did not fill silences with noise the way some people did, and after a moment she heard herself say, "I have a financial complication from San Antonio that I am working through," and stopped there. He did not ask for details. He said, "If there is anything I can do," and left the sentence open and unpressuring. She said, "There is not, but thank you." She regretted not telling him the truth later. Not because it would have changed what happened, but because the keeping of it created a small, necessary distance between them that she would afterward recognize as the first crack in what might otherwise have held. The revelation, when it came from entirely the wrong direction. She had been in Harlan Creek 6 weeks when a man named Curtis Blake arrived on the northbound stage from Laredo. Curtis Blake was lean and sun-darkened, and had the unhurried manner of someone who had grown accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any room he entered, and no longer felt the need to announce it. He had a marshal's badge on his coat and eyes that took inventory of everything and disclosed nothing. He went directly to the sheriff's office and was there for 2 hours, and by the time the sun went down that evening, word had moved through Harlan Creek's 340 residents the way words always moved in small towns, fast, in every direction, with a velocity that increased with each transfer. The word was this: there had been a robbery 4 years prior on the Abilene-Amarillo route. 2 men dead, one of them a deputy, $12,000 in cattle market bonds, never recovered. One of the men, identified as a participant in the robbery, had died the following year in a different county under a different charge. The other was believed to be living under an assumed identity somewhere in the hill country of Texas. Susanna heard this the next morning from Aldous, who had heard it from the sheriff, who had mentioned it in passing at the feed store, which meant that roughly half the county had heard it before she had. She received the information with the usual combination of interest and detachment with which she received most items of public news that did not directly concern her. The direct concern arrived 12 hours later. She had been closing the store ledgers for the evening when Perry came in, and she knew before he said a single word that something was wrong because he moved differently, carefully, like someone navigating a room full of things that might break. "I need to tell you something," he said. She set down her pen. He was quiet for a moment that stretched. She could see him working out how to say it, which was the thing about Perry Hayes she had come to trust most entirely. He never said things without having thought about them first. He never deployed words carelessly. Whatever was coming, he had been carrying it and deciding how to set it down, and the decision to set it down now meant something. "My name," he said, "is not originally Hayes." The world did not stop. It did not feel like a revelation should feel, which was perhaps the most alarming thing about it. She simply looked at him and waited and felt a slow, cold thing beginning to move up from her stomach. "I was born Perry Aldridge," he said, "in Abilene. I changed my name in 1878. I came to Harlan Creek that same year. Abilene, 1878. She was good at arithmetic. She had always been good at arithmetic. The robbery," she said. He did not flinch. "I was there," he said. "I want to tell you that first before I tell you everything else because I owe you the worst of it first. 2 men died," she said. "Yes." His voice did not break, but the effort of keeping it steady was visible. "I did not kill them. That is true, and I need you to know it is true. But I also need you to know that being present while they died and not stopping it makes me responsible in a way I have had to live with every day for 4 years." He stopped. "I was 24. I was in debt. A man I had grown up with told me the job was simple: ride along, watch the road, collect a portion. There were supposed to be no guns involved. I found out there were guns when the guns were already out." He looked at her with the gray-green eyes that she had spent 6 weeks learning and said, "I ran. I am ashamed of that too. I ran and I built a life, and I have tried every day to be the kind of man who deserved to keep it." She sat very still. "Clara knew," he said. "I told her before we married. She said the man she knew was not the man from Abilene, and she believed that, and I believe it too, but belief does not change the law, and the law is here now. Curtis Blake," she said. "I went to see him this afternoon," Perry said. "I told him who I was. I told him everything." She absorbed this. "You went to him." "I was going to have to run again or turn myself in," he said. "I chose to turn myself in. I have a daughter. I am not taking her on the run." He paused. "I am not leaving Ellie the way my father left me." There it was. The dark past, the hidden secret, the choice that was not a choice at all for a man like him. She understood all of it with a clarity that made her want to cry and made her furious at the same time, because she also understood what it meant. "Blake will take you to Abilene," she said. "Next week," Perry said. "He is waiting on verification of my identity from the county court. After that, trial." "What are the charges?" "Accessory to robbery, possibly more, depending on the prosecutor." He said it with the flat honesty of someone who had already done the legal arithmetic and arrived at a number he did not like. "I could face 2 to 10 years, or I could be acquitted. Blake says the evidence that I participated directly in the killings is thin. My cooperation and the 4 years of a clean record will be considered." She was quiet for a long time. The lamp between them made shadows on the wall that moved when the night breeze came through the window. Outside, Harlan Creek was doing what small towns do in the evening, settling down, going quiet, becoming itself in the dark. "Why are you telling me now?" she said finally. "You could have said nothing. I would not have known." He looked at her steadily. "Because you deserve the truth," he said, "and because I am not willing to let you have feelings for a man you do not actually know." She felt the sentence land somewhere very close to her heart. "You have been managing your feelings quite conspicuously for the last 6 weeks," she said. "Yes," he said simply, "and now you are leaving. I do not have a choice. What happens to Ellie?" The first thing that moved across his face that was not perfectly controlled. "My sister lives in Austin," he said. "She has offered to take Ellie while I am away. And the ranch? My foreman, Sam Garrett, will manage the cattle. The land will be here when I come back." He said it with the certainty of a man who needed to believe in it. "If I come back." She stood up then, and she looked at him across the lamp and the ledger and the 6 weeks of something she had not named, and she said, "I am angry with you." "I know," he said. "I am angry that you kept this from me." "I know," he said again. "I should have told you sooner. I did not know how to tell you, and then I did not want to lose what we were becoming, and that was cowardice, and I am sorry for it." She believed him. That was the thing that made her the most angry. She believed him completely. "Go home to your daughter," she said. "I need to think." He stood for another moment, then put his hat on and walked to the door and then stopped with his hand on the frame without turning. "For what it is worth," he said, "everything you know about me is true. The rest of it is also true, but it does not cancel the first part." He went out. She sat alone with the lamp for a very long time. She did not sleep that night. She lay in her room above the store with the western window showing her a sky full of stars, and she thought through the whole shape of it with the same methodical attention she brought to financial ledgers, looking for the places where the columns did not add up, looking for the errors. She did not find any that resolved things in a simpler direction. What she found was a man who had made a catastrophic mistake at 24, who had built a good life out of the wreckage of it, who had loved a woman and lost her, and was raising his daughter with a gentleness and honesty she had observed directly with her own eyes. A man who had told the truth the moment the truth became unavoidable, and had chosen a course of action that required considerable courage. She also found, if she was honest, a woman who was afraid of wanting something that was already leaving, afraid of the particular territory of loving a man who was going to prison, possibly, who might come back changed or diminished or not at all. She had been afraid of this kind of thing for a long time, in ways that had nothing to do with Perry Hayes and everything to do with her father's slow decline, and the way loving someone who is going under can pull you under with them. By the time the stars began to fade, she had arrived at the conclusion that fear was insufficient reason not to love someone who was worth loving. She went to the Double H the next morning before the store opened. Perry was in the barn when she arrived, working on something with the contained, focused movement of a man keeping himself busy to keep from thinking. He heard her come in and straightened and looked at her with the careful expression of someone who had spent the night preparing for something irretrievable. "I am not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her. "I am angry," she said. "I am still angry, and I am going to need you to understand why the secrecy was a problem and not do it again. But I am not going anywhere." He stood very still for a moment. Then he sat down on the edge of a hay bale and pressed his hands against his knees and looked at the floor. When he looked up, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the barn light. "You should think carefully about what that means," he said. "While I am in Abilene, I will think carefully about it for the rest of my life," she said. "I have already been thinking carefully about it all night. I am done with the thinking portion. I am moving on to the deciding portion. I have decided." She looked at him levelly. "I am not telling you this because I expect anything from you. I am telling you because you told me the truth and you deserve the truth back." He stood up and crossed the barn and stopped close enough that she could have reached out and touched him if she wanted to, which she did want to very much. "Susanna," he said. Her name in his mouth sounded different than it did in everyone else's mouth. It sounded like something he had been saving up, like something he was careful with. "Yes," she said. He raised one hand and touched her face just briefly, his thumb against her cheekbone, the way you touch something you are afraid of damaging. "I will come back," he said. "I know," she said. "I am going to hold you to that." That was 3 days before Curtis Blake came for him on the appointed morning, and that was how Susanna came to be standing on the porch of the Double H, holding a tin of Wildflowers while Perry Hayes walked away from her, in the direction of a reckoning she could not follow him into. She spent the night of his departure in the small guest room of the ranch house, because Perry had asked Sam Garrett to ask her if she would stay with Ellie until he could arrange transport to Austin, and she had said yes without hesitation. Ellie had cried once in the morning for about 4 minutes with the efficient grief of a child who had already learned the particular skill of crying as release rather than performance, and then had dried her face and helped Susanna make breakfast with the focused industry of a small person determined to be useful. The tin sat on the kitchen table. "Where did you get the tin?" Susanna asked, turning it over in her hands. It was an old tobacco tin, the kind that would have come from a general store with the faded red flower design. "It was Mama's," Ellie said. "She kept her sewing needles in it. I washed it out." She looked at it with the same expression her father had when he spoke about Clara, fond, clear-eyed, not trying to make the loss into something else. "I went to the flower field for 3 days. I picked different ones each time so they would all last different amounts of time when they dried." Susanna looked at the child for a long moment. "That was very thoughtful," she said. "They are for when you come back," Ellie repeated. "Both of you." She said it with the absolute conviction of someone who had decided this was how it was going to be, and Susanna felt the words move through her like something she could build on, a foundation beneath all the uncertainty and fear and the grinding practical reality of what was coming. She sent word to Aldous that she would need a few days. Aldous sent back a note that said take all the time you need, and also that he had heard the town council was discussing hiring a permanent bookkeeper for the county records, and she should consider applying when the time was right, which was his way of saying he thought she was going to stay. She helped Perry's sister, a sensible woman named Rachel who arrived from Austin 3 days later with 2 trunks, and an unflappable practicality about the whole situation that Susanna found tremendously steadying: settle Ellie for the journey south. She watched Ellie climb into Rachel's wagon with the tin tucked under her arm, her 2 favorite books in a separate satchel, and her small face set with an expression of determined optimism that was so perfectly her father's that Susanna had to look away briefly. Before the wagon moved, Ellie leaned over the side and said, "You are going to write to him, aren't you?" "Every week," Susanna said. "And you are going to stay in Harlan Creek?" "Yes." Ellie appeared to weigh this. "Then it will be all right," she said, with the serene certainty of a 7-year-old who has decided the matter is settled. And the wagon moved off down the road toward Austin, and Susanna stood in the ranch yard until it was out of sight, and then went back inside the empty house and sat at the kitchen table and began writing her first letter to Perry Hayes at the Taylor County Jail in Abilene. The letter was practical, initially. She told him about the Double H in the days after his departure, the weather, the condition of the cattle as reported by Sam Garrett, the state of the southwest pasture fencing that Sam had mentioned needed attention. She told him about Ellie's departure and that the child had gone bravely and that Rachel seemed entirely capable. She told him about the Wildflower field, which she had visited that afternoon on her way back to town, and how the bluebonnets were going to seed but the prairie asters were coming in, and the whole field was shifting color the way spring does when it begins its slow negotiation with summer. Then she wrote, near the bottom of the page, "I have been thinking about what you said in the barn. I have been thinking about it with considerable attention. I believe you when you say you will come back. I am going to continue believing this with the same stubborn confidence with which your daughter believes it. And if you ever doubt it, you should think about the tin and what is in it and who put it there, because she did not do that for a man who was not coming back. Neither did I." She folded it and sealed it and sent it on the weekly stage to San Antonio for forwarding. And then she went back to her room above Aldous Crane's store, and the western light came in long and golden, and she told herself she was going to be fine, and this time she believed it. His first letter came 3 weeks later, written in the careful hand of a man who had gone to decent school and not continued in it long enough to become careless. The letters slightly cramped but perfectly legible, and his sentences built the way he built things in real life, solid, with their weight distributed correctly. He told her the jail in Abilene was not comfortable but was not brutal either. The marshal who ran it, a man named Harker, was fair. The preliminary hearing had gone better than his attorney had expected. The prosecution's evidence for his direct participation in the killings was indeed thin. His voluntary surrender and cooperation had been noted formally in the court record, which his attorney said would matter. The 2 living witnesses from the original robbery had agreed that he had not fired a weapon and had not been present when the deputies died. He faced a charge of accessory to robbery, and his attorney believed a sentence of 12 to 18 months was possible, or an acquittal if the jury weighted his conduct appropriately. Then, at the bottom of the page, in handwriting that was slightly less careful than the rest of it, as if the formality had slipped, "I have thought about the barn conversation more times than I can accurately report. I want you to know that it is not a small thing to me, what you said. In fact, it is the largest thing that has happened to me in a very long time, and I am carrying it with considerable care, because it matters very much, and I do not want to be careless with something that matters." She read that paragraph 4 times and then wrote back immediately, and the correspondence between them, over the following months, became its own thing. A conversation conducted across 300 miles and a temporal gap of 8 to 10 days in each direction, which required them to develop a kind of patience with communication that turned out to produce a remarkable quality of honesty. You could not impulsively say things in a letter the way you could in person. You could not walk them back. You chose each thing deliberately, and the deliberateness had weight. She learned him more deeply in those letters than she might have in the same period of time spent side by side, because the absence of the physical removed all the comfortable shorthand of proximity and left only words, and the words he chose, over months of choosing them, told her things about the interior of him that she was not sure he would have disclosed as directly in person. He was afraid that Ellie would forget who he was. Not in the literal sense, but in the sense of the texture and warmth of him, the daily accumulating knowledge of a parent that builds the sense of being known and loved. He was afraid she would become more Rachel's daughter than his in the 18 months he would be away. He did not say this dramatically, but she could hear it in the particular care with which he asked about Ellie's letters, and the way he always answered Ellie's questions. Ellie wrote to him too, with the spelling and the fierce sincerity of a 7-year-old, with long, careful detail, as if he was trying to remain present in the only way available to him. She told him about the town council bookkeeping position, which she applied for in June and received in July, which added $8 a month to her income and allowed her, among other things, to send a money order toward the Theodore Marsh debt each month with an additional surety that she was making verifiable progress, which satisfied Marsh's solicitor enough to hold the legal action. She did not tell Perry about Marsh until her third letter because she had made peace with needing help on her own terms, and this was not the moment for it. And when she did tell him, he wrote back with a careful restraint that she recognized as him not leaping to offer things she had not asked for, which was exactly the right response, and she loved him for it. She did not write the word loved for several more months. She felt it with a steadiness and clarity that no longer surprised her, but she wanted to say it in person, when he was there, because that was the right order of things, and she was going to wait for the right order even if it required considerable patience. The trial came in September 1882. His attorney sent a telegram to Sam Garrett at the Double H, which Sam brought to Susanna directly because everyone in Harlan Creek understood the geography of the situation by now, and the telegram said, "Verdict delivered. Acquitted on lesser charges. 12 months for accessory to property theft. Sentence reduced for cooperation and time served. Expected release March 1883. She sat with the telegram in the store, and Aldous watched her from behind the counter with the particular worried kindness of a man who has adopted an unofficial responsibility for someone's welfare. And she read it through 3 times and then said, 12 months from arrest. He was arrested in May. He will be out in May 1883. That is not so very long, Aldous said carefully. She looked up. No, she said, it is not so very long, and she felt something in her chest that was not relief precisely but was adjacent to it, the particular internal settling that happens when the uncertainty resolves itself into a duration that has a known edge. She wrote to him that evening, and told him she was glad, and told him 12 months was entirely manageable, and told him The spring cattle prices had gone up 6%, according to the figures she was seeing in the county records, and that the Double H was going to be in better shape commercially than when he left. She told him Sam Garrett was a trustworthy man who took good care of the place. She told him the prairie asters had given way to goldenrod, and that the fall was coming in with the particular golden intensity it sometimes had in the hill country. Then she told him that Ellie had written her a letter from Austin, with a drawing of the wildflower field done in colored pencil, and that the drawing was hanging in the window of her room above the store, where the western light came through it in the evenings and made the colors glow. She spent the winter in Harlan Creek with a purposefulness that surprised even her. She had, she realized, spent the previous several years of her life existing in a kind of holding pattern, maintaining situations rather than building them, keeping things stable rather than constructing anything permanent. The combination of the correspondence with Perry and the town council bookkeeping work, and the gradual, specific way in which Harlan Creek had begun to feel like somewhere rather than somewhere temporary had produced in her a new orientation. She was building something. She was not entirely sure of its shape yet, but she could feel its structure taking form under her hands like a thing being made. She paid off $200 of the Marsh debt by the end of February 1883 and received a final accounting letter from Marsh's solicitor in March, indicating that the remaining $412 was due by the end of July, or foreclosure proceedings on the original property would be initiated, except that there was no original property, because she had no property. And the solicitor's letter had a slightly confused quality that suggested even Marsh's legal representative was not certain what exactly would be foreclosed upon. She wrote back with complete composure explaining this and offering a payment schedule that would retire the debt in full by December 1883, and she was fairly certain the solicitor had accepted it, which would make Marsh's remaining leverage approximately theoretical. The other thing she did that winter was go to the Double H twice a month to meet with Sam Garrett and review the ranch accounts, which Perry had asked her to do in a letter in September, phrased so carefully as an offer she was free to decline that she had recognized it as one of the moments in which he was trying very hard not to overstep something. She had agreed because the accounts genuinely needed attention, and because being in that house and that yard and that barn with the familiar smell of horses and cedar, and the particular quality of light in the east-facing kitchen window made her feel close to something she was waiting for. She found, in the process of reviewing the ranch accounts, that Sam Garrett was every bit as trustworthy as advertised. The Double H was well managed. The cattle were healthy and the prices were improving, and she identified 2 adjustments to the supply purchasing that would save approximately $40 annually, which was not a fortune but was also not nothing. She wrote these findings to Perry with the pleasure of a person who has solved a puzzle, and his reply came back with something that felt through the words like the particular happiness of a man who is being seen in the way he most wants to be seen. She also repaired 2 of Ellie's books that had been left behind and were coming loose at the bindings. She left them on the kitchen table, and they were still there each time she came back, nobody having moved them, and they felt like markers of something intended. March arrived, April, the letters continued. His were longer now, more reflective. He had been reading in the prison library with an intensity that she found entirely in keeping with the man she had been learning all along. He had read through a significant portion of Texas land law, which he said was relevant practically and also philosophically interesting. He had read 2 novels she had recommended in an earlier letter, and had opinions about both of them, specific and argued opinions, not the diplomatic agreement she might have expected from a man trying to impress someone, but the genuine engaged disagreement of a person who has read carefully and thought carefully, and arrived somewhere different and is willing to say so. She loved those letters particularly. May came on a Tuesday with a hot wind from the south, and a sky the color of bleached denim, and Susanna was in the store at mid-morning when she heard the stage. She did not run. She finished the entry she was making in the ledger with careful precision, and capped the ink bottle and set down the pen, and then walked to the store door and stood in the frame with the morning sunlight coming white and straight down on the street. The stage had stopped, and the door was opening, and the first person out was a woman with a carpet bag, and behind her was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that had grown longer than she had ever seen it and needed cutting, and he stood in the street with his hat in his hands exactly as he had stood on the porch of the Double H a year ago, except that everything was different now and they both knew it. He saw her in the store doorway. He was still for a moment. Then he came across the street at a pace that was not quite running, but had the controlled energy of a person who is choosing very deliberately not to run. He stopped in front of her. He was thinner. There was something behind his eyes that had not been there before, a quality of having been somewhere very difficult and come back from it and knowing the full cost of both directions. But the gray-green eyes were the same, and the way he looked at her was the same, and he said, "Susanna," in the same way he had always said it, like something precious and careful. She said, "You cut your hair," because his hair was shorter than it had been in her last mental image of him, and the observation was completely beside the point, except that it came out because she was standing in front of him finally, and her mind was running in 6 directions. He laughed. It was the best sound she had heard in a year, and it broke something loose in her chest that had been held carefully in place since May of last year. "I cut my hair in Abilene 2 weeks ago," he said. "I wanted to look presentable." "For what?" she said. "For this," he said, and kissed her. It was not the first kiss of 2 people who barely know each other and are discovering territory. It was the kiss of 2 people who have been writing letters for a year, who know things about each other that go down to the bone, who have been waiting with a sustained and effortful patience for exactly this moment. It was thorough and unhurried, and when it ended they were both slightly breathless, and he was smiling with the wholeness she had been waiting to see, and she thought, finally, with a completeness that settled through her like warmth. "I have been thinking about that for approximately 12 months, he said. "I know," she said. "You said as much in February." "Did I? I was trying to be subtle." "You were not even slightly subtle." He laughed again, and she thought she could listen to that sound for the rest of her life, without finding it repetitive. He went to the Double H that afternoon, and she rode out with him on Constance, who seemed pleased to see her, and expressed this in the way of horses by being slightly showy about her gait for the first quarter mile. Sam Garrett met them in the yard with the handshake of a man who is genuinely glad to see his employer, and also ready to hand back the responsibility, and they walked the property together, and it was in good shape, which Perry took in with a quiet, visible relief that was partially practical and partially the relief of a man who needed to see that the thing he had built had survived his absence. In the kitchen, her 2 books were still on the table. The tin was not there because it was in Austin with Ellie. The absence of it was a specific shape. They had written of the future carefully in the letters without quite naming it directly, because there were things that wanted to be said in person, and both of them had understood this without discussing it. That evening on the porch, in the same chairs where they had sat a year ago watching the dusk come in over the hills, Perry said, "I need to ask you something." "Ask," she said. "The Double H is a working ranch," he said. "It is not a comfortable life in the way of San Antonio. The work is constant, and the seasons are difficult, and I am going to be building back from a year's absence for at least another full year." He looked at her. "I am asking you to be part of this, all of it, not just the parts that are easy." He paused. "I am asking if you will marry me." She had been waiting for it, and it still produced a physical sensation of something bright and warm moving through her from head to foot. "Yes," she said, and it came out entirely steady because she had never been more certain of anything in her life. He exhaled in a way that suggested he had been holding that breath for some portion of the preceding 12 months, which she found remarkably endearing for a man she had just agreed to marry and told him so. And he said he had been uncertain, because he thought perhaps she had too much sense to want to bind herself to a man with a complicated legal history and a cattle ranch. And she said that her sense was precisely what had led her to this conclusion, and that he should give it more credit. He wrote to Rachel and Ellie that night, a letter he read to Susanna before sealing, which was personal and honest, and in its description of Susanna used words that made her look out at the dark yard so he would not see the effect they had on her. Ellie's response arrived 8 days later and consisted of a single sentence, "I knew it," followed by a drawing of two people standing in a field of wildflowers that had both Susanna's characteristic posture and Perry's characteristic stance captured with the accuracy of a child who pays extremely close attention. And at the bottom of the drawing, in Ellie's careful printing, was a note that read, "I am bringing the tin back." They were married in the church at the north end of Harlan Creek's Main Street on the second Saturday of June, 1883. By Reverend Aldous Crane, who had been ordained in 1871, and performed marriages approximately 4 times a year with a ceremony that was brief, sincere, and suffused with the specific warmth of a man who genuinely believed in what he was doing. Ellie stood beside Susanna in a blue dress that Rachel had made for the occasion, holding the tin in both hands with the solemnity of someone who has been assigned an important office and intends to execute it with full seriousness. After the vows and the kiss, which was slightly longer than strictly ceremonial, Ellie presented the tin to Susanna with both hands formally and said, "You both came back," in the tone of someone completing a transaction that had been outstanding for over a year. Susanna took the tin and looked inside. The dried flowers were still there, the bluebonnets faded to pale silver blue, the paintbrush gone a warm russet, the clover brown and papery, all of them holding their shapes with the tenacity of things that had dried well in the right conditions. "We both came back," she agreed, and she met Perry's eyes over Ellie's head, and what she saw there was the full and complete form of everything they had been building toward. Not the beginning of something, but the arrival at a thing that had been taking shape in letters and conversations and ordinary Tuesdays in a general store, and a walk to the end of a street and back, and she felt the rightness of it with every part of herself. The reception was in the churchyard, attended by most of Harlan Creek's population plus Sam Garrett and his wife, and 2 of the double H hands, and Aldous Crane produced a quantity of food that suggested considerable advanced planning, and the party went on until well into the evening with the particular happiness of a small community celebrating something it has been hoping for and watching the slow development of for some months. At the end of the evening, when Ellie had finally fallen asleep against Sam Garrett's wife's shoulder, and the stars were fully out and the night air had gone from warm to merely comfortable, Susanna and Perry sat on the bench outside the churchyard gate and were briefly, perfectly still. "The debt," he said quietly. He had known about it for months, had offered twice and she had declined twice, and now it was different. "I have a payment schedule," she said. "It will be retired by December." "We have a payment schedule now," he said, "and a joint income from the ranch and the county bookkeeping. December seems conservative. I think September." She considered this. "October," she said. "September and a half," he said. She laughed, which startled a mockingbird somewhere in the dark, and he took her hand and held it, and they sat like that for a while in the good dark. And Susanna Barrett, who was now Susanna Hayes, though she planned to keep Barrett professionally because she had built a reputation with it, felt the specific and unrepeatable contentment of a woman who has arrived somewhere she intended to be. The following years were built with the same quality she had noticed in Perry's letters and in his conversations, and in the way he managed his land and his people, careful and solid, with the weight distributed correctly so nothing cracked under pressure. They were not easy years in the way of uncomplicated years. The summer of 1883 brought a dry spell that worried the pastures and required moving the cattle twice to new grazing. The fall brought a dispute with a neighboring rancher over a water source that required 2 trips to the county court and considerable patience, before it was resolved in their favor. Theodore Marsh retired the debt in October, precisely as she had predicted, and his solicitor's final letter was so neutral in tone that she suspected even Marsh had arrived at the conclusion that the whole enterprise had been more effort than it was worth. Ellie came home from Austin in July 1883 permanently, after 3 weeks of negotiation between Perry and Rachel, about the timing that was entirely amicable and resulted in Rachel visiting for a month each fall thereafter, which worked well for everyone. Ellie reintegrated into life at the double age with the adaptability of a child who had been loved consistently by multiple adults, and therefore understood that home was made of people rather than geography. She reclaimed her room and her books and the wildflower field with equal efficiency, and by September she was treating Susanna's presence as entirely settled, permanent, and unremarkable, which was the best possible form of acceptance. She also placed the tin on the kitchen shelf, between a bottle of vanilla extract and a jar of buttons, and it stayed there. Occasionally Susanna took it down and held it, the dried flowers rustling faintly inside, and she thought about the morning on the porch and the weight of it in her shaking hands, and she thought about what it was to receive a child's faith as a gift and carry it forward. In the spring of 1884, Susanna discovered she was expecting. She told Perry on a Thursday evening in April, in the kitchen while they were doing the dinner dishes, and his response was a complete stillness for approximately 5 seconds, followed by the most unguarded expression she had ever seen on his face, a joy that was enormous and slightly stunned, as if it had arrived larger than expected. He put down the dish he was drying. He crossed the kitchen and held her face in both hands and looked at her and then said, in a voice that was not entirely steady, "Are you all right? Are you well? Is everything is fine," she said. "I am perfectly well. I am going to need you to be considerably calmer about this than you are being right now." "I am calm," he said, not calmly. "You are not." "I am going to be calm in approximately 20 minutes, he said, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down. Ellie's response to the news was more measured than her father's. She appeared at the breakfast table the next morning, regarded both of them with the evaluating gravity she brought to important matters, and said, "Is it going to sleep in my room?" "No," Perry said. "We are going to put the crib in the corner room." "Will it be loud at night?" "Yes, probably for the first few months," Susanna said. Ellie absorbed this. "I want it to know me from the beginning," she said, which was not a question and not a demand, but a statement of intention so clear and confident that both Susanna and Perry looked at each other over Ellie's head with the simultaneous warmth of parents who are watching something good taking shape. "It will know you from before the beginning," Susanna said. "I promise." The baby arrived in November 1884, a boy, born during the first hard freeze of the season, while the north wind rattled the shutters and Sam Garrett rode 12 miles to bring the doctor from Harlan Creek, and Ellie sat outside the bedroom door with her back against the wall, and her hands folded in her lap like a small guardian. Perry held Susanna's hand through the worst of it with the focused stillness of a man who has decided his function is to be unmovable and is executing this decision with everything he has. The baby was born just after midnight, healthy and loud in the particular outraged way of newborns who have been deposited into a world that is considerably colder and brighter and louder than the one they just left. Perry held him in his arms with the specific careful terror of a man holding something irreplaceable, and Ellie was allowed in and stood on her tiptoes beside the bed to look at him, and after a long, serious examination she said, "He looks like a very old man." "He looks like a baby," Perry said. "He looks like a very old baby," Ellie amended, which was accurate, and Susanna laughed weakly from the bed, and the doctor looked at them all with the weary affection of a man who has delivered enough babies to know that the conversations immediately afterward are always slightly incoherent. They named him Daniel, for her father, with the middle name James, for Perry's father who had died when Perry was 12, and whom Perry spoke of rarely, but with a careful love that suggested the loss had been formative in ways that were still being processed. Daniel James Hayes arrived in November 1884 and was, as predicted, loud at night for the first 3 months, during which Ellie slept with a pillow over her head and emerged each morning looking slightly persecuted but fundamentally committed to the project. He became, by spring, a source of considerable interest to his sister, who had decided that his development was an ongoing experiment worth documenting. She kept a notebook in which she recorded the dates of his various milestones: the first time he rolled over, the first time he sat up, the first time he ate solid food, and expressed his opinion of it with extensive facial commentary. She read to him with the seriousness of a person who believes in early education, and whether or not he understood, he appeared to find the sound of her voice agreeable, and would fall asleep to it with a regularity that Ellie found both flattering and scientifically interesting. By the time Daniel was walking and talking, which he did at a pace that suggested he had been observing the household and taking notes before deciding to participate, Harlan Creek had grown to something closer to 500 residents and was getting its first proper bank and a second general store, and a school that Ellie attended with the conviction of someone who regards education as a competitive endeavor. Susanna was now the county clerk and bookkeeper for both Harlan Creek and the neighboring settlement of Clay Wells, and her salary had risen to $32 a month, which had been absolutely impossible to imagine when she had arrived with $43, and a talent that no one in San Antonio had considered valuable. The Double H had expanded modestly 40 new acres acquired from a neighboring farm that had failed in the dry years, a second well drilled and successfully hit at 60 feet, a new barn to replace the old one that had finally given up its structural argument with time. Perry had paid off the remaining land mortgage in 1885, and the ranch was clear, which meant the income from the cattle drives was theirs entirely, and the future of it was secure. In 1886, when Daniel was 18 months old and beginning to be a real person with opinions and preferences, and a particular attachment to a carved wooden horse Perry had made him over the winter, Susanna realized she was expecting again. This time she told Perry in the flower field, on a Sunday afternoon in April when they had brought both children out to see the bluebonnets at their peak, and Ellie was explaining to Daniel with great authority about the different species, and Daniel was eating a clover with the absent-mindedness of a toddler, engaged in independent research, and the hill was covered in blue, and the sky above it was the particular deep Texas blue that meant summer was thinking about arriving. And she turned to Perry and said it quietly, and he put his arm around her and pulled her close and said nothing for a moment, just held her in the field among the flowers with the spring wind moving everything around them. In slow waves. 2 children, he said finally. And a half, she said. He looked at her and she could see him counting forward to November, December, and his expression had the settled, particular happiness of a man who has arrived somewhere he thought for a long time he did not deserve, and has made peace with deserving it. These will need replenishing, he said, nodding toward the tin which Ellie had brought with her to the field because she brought it sometimes when she came out here, a habit that had persisted from the original 3 mornings of gathering. It sat on the flat rock where Ellie had set it, and the old dried flowers inside were 4 years old now, faded to near nothing, still there. I know, Susanna said. Ellie looked over from where she had crouched beside Daniel, whose clover investigation had shifted to a general examination of the soil, and called, "Are you talking about the tin?" "We are," Perry said. Ellie regarded them both. "I think we should put in new ones every spring," she said. "So there are always some that are new and some that are old. So the tin always has everything in it." Susanna looked at her stepdaughter, this fierce and specific and altogether remarkable person who had handed her a tin of dried flowers on a morning a year and a half before her father came home, who had pressed herself against Susanna's side, and pointed the way forward with the absolute authority of a child who had decided how things were going to be and was going to hold everyone to it. "That is an excellent idea," Susanna said. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet and the south wind was coming warm through the open window, and the lamp on the table made its familiar golden circle, Perry took down the tin from the shelf and set it on the table between them. He opened it. The old dried flowers were inside, 4 years old, holding their shapes with that same tenacious fragility. He reached into the small bunch of fresh flowers they had gathered from the field that afternoon, bluebonnets, a few paintbrush, some of the prairie asters just beginning to open, and placed them in the tin alongside the old ones. New colors among the faded ones. He put the tin back on the shelf and came and sat across from her, and they looked at it for a moment. "Both of you came back," she said softly, echoing Ellie's words from the day of their wedding. He reached across the table and took her hand. "We are never leaving again," he said. She believed him. She had believed him since the morning in the barn when he said it the first time, across all the months and letters and the slow, careful building of everything that was now theirs. She believed him now in the way she believed in the flowers returning each spring, no matter how dry the summer had been, not because it was guaranteed, but because it had been true every time she had tested it and she had learned to trust the evidence. Outside, the south wind moved through the cedar, and the night was very large and very quiet, and the stars over the Texas Hill Country were the same stars that had watched over all the generations of people who had loved each other across difficult distance and found their way back and rebuilt what needed rebuilding and made a life from it. The tin sat on the shelf between the vanilla and the button jar with its old flowers and its new ones, both kinds present, the accumulated evidence of years of coming back. The second child, a girl, arrived in November 1886, delivered with considerably less drama than Daniel, because the second time was faster, and the doctor made it to the ranch before the worst of it rather than just after, and Ellie sat outside the door again with the same posture of a small guardian, and Daniel sat next to her because at this point he went everywhere Ellie went, and Perry held Susanna's hand again with the same unmovable focus. And the baby arrived just before midnight in a much less violent fashion, and announced herself with a single clear cry that had a quality of pure assertion, as if she had arrived with opinions already formed. They named her Clara Susanna, for Perry's first wife and Susanna's own name, and the choosing of it had been Perry's idea, offered carefully, and Susanna had said yes without hesitation, because it seemed right to carry both forward, to let the name mean something about continuity rather than replacement. And Perry's expression when she said yes had been one of the things she kept. Ellie received her sister with the seriousness of an 11-year-old who had already documented one sibling's development and was prepared to document another. Daniel, at 2, was mostly interested in whether the baby could do anything useful yet, and upon discovering that the answer was no, went back to the carved horse. The ranch grew and the family grew, and the life they had built continued to prove itself sound. Daniel grew into a quiet, observant boy who had his father's love of land and his mother's capacity for sustained attention to detail, and who could, by the time he was 6, tell you the current per-head cattle price for 3 different grades at 2 different markets, which Susanna found both impressive and slightly alarming. Clara grew into a child who had her namesake's willfulness and Susanna's directness, who was walking before she should have been and talking in full sentences before most children her age, and who had the specific charming quality of someone who disagrees with you openly rather than obliquely. Ellie, at 12, at 13, at the edge of what she was becoming, retained the gravity and the intelligence and the ferocious loyalty that had characterized her from the beginning. She was her father's daughter in her love of the land and her mother's daughter in her discipline, and Susanna's influence was visible in the way she engaged with books and questions and the world beyond the hill country. She had decided she wanted to be a doctor, an ambition that was logistically complicated in 1888 for a girl in Texas, but which everyone around her, including particularly Perry and Susanna, had responded to by beginning immediately to research how it might be made possible, because the Hayes family's approach to ambitious plans was to start working on the practical details. In the spring of 1888, Susanna went out to the flower field on a Saturday morning alone, before anyone else was up, which she did sometimes just for the pleasure of the quiet and the early light. She went to the flat rock where the tin lived sometimes when it was brought out here, though today she had left it on the shelf. She sat in the beginning of the bluebonnets. It was early April, and they were only just coming in, a week or two away from their peak, and she thought about the last 6 years with the attentive, grateful quality of someone who has learned not to take good things for granted. She heard footsteps behind her and knew them without looking. He sat down beside her with the ease of someone who has been sitting beside the same person for 6 years and has made himself perfectly at home there. "You left before breakfast," he said. "I will be back for breakfast," she said. He stretched his legs out in the spring grass. "Daniel is trying to convince Clara that the wooden horse is a real horse," he said. "She is not convinced. She said if it was a real horse it would make noise." "She is not wrong," Susanna said. "She never is," Perry said, with the fond exasperation of a parent who has produced a child whose sharpness occasionally outpaces its usefulness. They sat among the early bluebonnets in the morning light, and the field was beginning to wake up around them, not yet at peak, but on its way, the way things are when they are in the process of becoming what they are going to be. Above them, a pair of scissor-tailed flycatchers performed their particular acrobatic grief against the pale morning sky. "Ellie wants to look into the St. Louis Medical School," Perry said. "I know," Susanna said. "I wrote to them last week to ask about the requirements and the admission procedures and whether they have admitted women in the past." He turned to look at her. "I did not tell her yet because I did not want to make a promise before I had information," Susanna said. "But I intend to tell her as soon as I hear back because she should know someone is working on it." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You are something remarkable, Susanna Hayes." "Barrett Hayes," she said, which was what she put on professional correspondence. "Barrett Hayes," he amended. "That is even more remarkable. That is 2 remarkable things at once." She laughed, and the scissor-tails startled and wheeled and came back and settled again, and the morning light was coming in long and warm from the east, and the bluebonnets were opening in the warmth of it, blue deepening as the day strengthened. She thought about the first morning, the tin in her hands, Perry walking away, Ellie pressing into her side with the absolute faith that everyone was coming back, because she had decided it was so, and she intended to hold the world to it. The weight of that faith, given to her by a child who had every reason to believe otherwise, and the way she had carried it through 12 months of letters and arithmetic and a Texas winter, and the way it had turned out to be not faith at all in the end, but knowledge, the specific kind of knowledge you earn by showing up every day and doing the work and trusting the person who is showing up on the other side of the distance. Perry reached over and took her hand, the same way he had on the first night after their wedding when they had sat outside the churchyard gate in the good dark. She looked down at their joined hands in the morning light and then up at the field of flowers, and she thought, every spring they come back, even when the summer before was brutal, even when the conditions were hard. They remember to come back. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, and they sat in the flower field as the morning came fully in around them, and the double H stretched away behind them with the children and the work and the years of it, and the tin was on the shelf in the kitchen, full of old flowers and new ones, waiting to be added to again in the afternoon when they would bring the children out, and Ellie would choose new specimens with scientific precision, and Daniel would put in whatever he could reach, and Clara would put in the largest flowers she could find because she did things at full scale, and the tin would be a little fuller than it was before. The world was not simple. It was not without its difficulties or its histories or the places where things had gone wrong and required steady, patient rebuilding. The injustices that operated in that world, the ones that had kept Susanna's talent invisible in San Antonio, the ones that had made Perry's choices at 24 far more constrained than they should have been, the ones that would make Ellie's path to medicine longer and harder than any man's, those did not vanish because the Hayes family was happy. But against them and alongside them, and in the particular daily resistance of building something honest and durable and full of genuine love, there was the ranch in the morning light and the flowers that came back and the tin that held all the years of it together, old and new at once. "We should go back," Perry said, "before Daniel convinces the horse it is real through sheer persistence." "In a minute," Susanna said. He settled back beside her. She let the minute become several minutes, the way good things are allowed to last when you are no longer afraid of them ending, when you have learned that they do not end but change shape and carry forward, the way dried flowers carry their color forward even as it fades, the way a child's faith carries a woman through a year of letters and grief and arithmetic until the stage door opens and the man she loves steps back into the street, thinner and changed and entirely himself. Then she stood and he stood, and they walked back through the morning field together toward the house where their children were. And the smoke was starting from the chimney, which meant Sam Garrett's wife was making breakfast next door. And the horses in the corral were moving in the morning light. And everything was as it was, and as it would be. The ordinary and extraordinary miracle of a life that had found its right shape and settled into it with the permanence of roots in good ground. Susanna Barrett Hayes walked home across the field of bluebonnets with her husband's hand in hers, and the spring light on her face and the tin on the shelf waiting for afternoon. And the story of how she had arrived here was complete, not ended, because lives do not end while they are being lived, but complete in the way of something that has become fully itself and knows it.